Hi, and welcome to part three of Colonization of America and the American Revolution for U.S. History and Government. We've already looked at the causes a bit with the French Revolution and so on. So now we're going to look a little bit at the war itself. So one of the first things to think about with the war is when it started, how did all the colonists kind of feel about this? And the reality was they had a kind of a mixed reaction. Roughly about a third, maybe closer to 40% of the colonists were what we call patriots. They wanted the revolution. About a third called themselves Tories, which meant they were loyalist or they were loyal to Britain. They wanted to stay with Britain. And roughly about a third wanted to stay neutral. Okay. So it's really important to kind of get an understanding of this revolution and how not all colonists were on board with it. That's something we kind of think happened. The second thing to think about is going into the war, what were the advantages and disadvantages for each side? And it's sort of like looking at a game and deciding which team is going to be more prepared. And when it came to manpower, weaponry, and experience in fighting, Britain had the Patriots beat hands down. They were a professional army, they knew what they were doing, and they were in really good shape. But the one advantage that the colonists had was they had a high morale for this war, meaning they were really motivated to win. This was their homeland. And they also had knowledge of this of the land itself. And I think that's really important for us to understand that knowledge of the land, knowing the land, and so on. Okay, so they had a home field advantage. But really, because of the major advantages Britain had, Britain really thought they were going to win this war. It was going to be an easy war. Now, as we move further into this, one of the things that we need to talk about is how this war goes from being a war where they're just trying to make things right with Britain to being a war in which it's about independence. We know the end of the story. And a lot of people were making arguments for independence, but the guy who probably made it best was Thomas Paine. And he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And he basically said it doesn't make a lot of sense for the colonies to remain under Britain. We've always done that because that's what we did. But the reality is the king is very far away. He doesn't know our affairs. We've been running things on our own pretty well. Why would we stay with him? And why would we stay with the British government? And this motivated a lot of people to think about the war in a different way, to think about it in terms of independence. And as a result of that, the leaders of the revolution, the Continental Congress, created the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence didn't really create a new government. It just kind of laid out their independence and why they were doing that. And we're going to look at this in class a little bit. But basically, when it was written in 1776 by Thomas Jefferson, with help from a committee that included Ben Franklin and John Adams, it really had three main parts. The first part we're going to look at is how it justified American independence. And then the second part was kind of a list of grievances or complaints the colonists had against the king. And you're going to see it's a pretty extensive list. And then lastly, they declared their independence. And they basically said, because of these things, because the government hasn't protected us, and because the king has done all these things, we're out of here. We're independent. And with that, the war shifts from being one of trying to make things right with Britain to being one of gaining independence. Now, wars always have key battles, and some of you might be a military history fan or whatever, but for our purposes, there's only two key battles you really need to know. The first is the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, and mainly because it's a big turning point in the war. The colonists have been losing a lot of battles, things aren't looking good, and they're really trying to get support from France. And France is not really sure that they're going to get a good benefit out of supporting a losing cause. But with the victory for the U.S. over Britain in this battle, France does lend its support and lends its ships and its soldiers and money to help out with the revolution. The other key battle is the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. That's the battle that ends the war, and the British under General Cornwallis surrender. And so that's a pretty important one to know. I would remind you to know that new government is called the Continental Congress. They had representatives from each state. They're going to start to call themselves states when they create their new government. And the British take on this is that they're committing treason, that they don't have the right to do this, the right to break away from Britain. And so these leaders of the revolution are taking great risk, because if they got caught by Britain, they would have been executed for treason. As they move forward and after they win the war, they create a new government under a document called the Articles of Confederation. It's the first Constitution of America. It's not the one we have now, but it's the first one. And it was written, as I said, during the war, took effect after the Battle of Yorktown, but it created a very decentralized government. And what I mean by decentralized is there's not a lot of power in one place. It's actually spread out amongst the states. And there's some real advantages to that. It means you're not going to have a government that's abusive like, say, Great Britain's was. But there's also disadvantages. For example, they had a hard time raising money for taxes because nobody wanted to pay them, and therefore had a hard time raising an army. So, for example, in the 1780s, when a group of farmers led by Daniel Shays had a rebellion in Massachusetts, and they were rebelling against the idea that they should be taxed, and they were also rebelling because they hadn't been paid for fighting in the war. This was a real negative because the new government couldn't stop this rebellion. In fact, it was the state of Massachusetts that had to send soldiers to stop it. But it could have really upset things having this full rebellion. And there were a lot of incidents kind of similar to that that made them realize maybe they need to create a new government. I would point out one positive of the Articles of Confederation, and that was the creation of the Northwest Ordinance in, like what is today Michigan and Ohio and Illinois. And those territories weren't states yet, but the Northwest Ordinance basically created a good system in which for them to become states. It kind of gave them certain things they had to follow to get there. And so it really made a good way for the nation to move westward. So as you review these things in the video, stop, take notes, do whatever you need to do. And then we're going to get a little more in depth in class with the Declaration of Independence.